Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because what you're about to read is going to change the way you see history forever. I'm not talking about a textbook fact. I'm talking about something very few people actually dare to imagine. How likely was it that you, with your body today, with your mind today, would have survived a voyage on a slave ship bound for Rio de Janeiro in the 18th century? The answer is brutal. And before you keep reading, if this kind of historical content that nobody told you about in school interests you, like and subscribe right now, because we're going to talk about things that official history preferred to bury. All right, let's get to the bottom of this. Imagine being ripped from your village in West Africa, somewhere in what is today Nigeria, Benin, Angola, or Senegal. There was no warning. There was no preparation. One night you were sleeping in your home, surrounded by your family, with the smell of wet earth and the sound of crickets, and by dawn you were already merchandise. Just like that. That violently. European traffickers, and also African kingdoms that collaborated with the trade, chained you together with dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, and marched you on foot to the coast. That journey could last weeks, without shoes, without enough food, with chains on your ankles cutting into your skin with every step. And that was only the beginning. When you arrived at the port, you were locked into what was called the barricade, a holding place that was basically a giant open-air cage or a rotting wooden structure, where you were crammed together with other captives while merchants negotiated prices. You could be there for days, weeks, even months. The heat was infernal. Water was scarce. Diseases had already begun to spread by that point. Dysentery, which is a devastating intestinal infection, was already among you before you even boarded the ship. You were already contaminated, already weakened, already broken inside before the ship even raised its anchor. And then they put you on the ship. Now this is where most people fail to understand the magnitude of what that moment meant. Because when you think of a ship, you picture something large, spacious, with a deck and wind in your face. Slave ships were nothing like that. The most common ones on the route to Brazil, known as the transatlantic slave trade or the triangular trade, were vessels between 20 and 40 meters long. And inside those ships, between 300 and 600 people were packed together, sometimes more. How was that even possible? I'll explain it in detail, and brace yourself, because this is hard to process. The ship's carpenters built wooden platforms inside the hull, like bunks, but with no space to sit up, no mattress, nothing. Those platforms were approximately 40 centimeters high. 40 centimeters. That's less than the height of a normal desk. That's where you lay down, chained, pressed against the person on your left and the person on your right, unable to turn over, unable to stretch your legs freely, unable to get up to use the bathroom. You remained in that position for weeks, sometimes for months. The voyage from the West African coast to Rio de Janeiro could last between 35 and 90 days, depending on the winds, the currents, and the condition of the ship. And during those days, the interior of the ship became something that the sailors themselves described as the closest place to hell they had ever seen in their lives. They wrote that the very same people who were participating in the business, the heat in the hold was suffocating. Without adequate ventilation, temperatures could exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Everyone sweated. Everyone urinated and defecated in the same space where they slept because the chains gave them no choice. The smell was so intense that sailors who went below to check on the captives had to cover their faces. Some vomited immediately, and the captives had been living like that for weeks. Weeks living in their own waste, in each other's waste, with open wounds from the chains that became infected in the humidity and filth. Tell me in the comments, had anyone ever told you these details in school? Because I believe the official education system left us with an enormous gap here, and I need to know if the same thing happened to you. Now let's talk about the diseases, because this is where the numbers become truly terrifying. Dysentery, as I already mentioned, was the #1 killer on board. It spread through contact with contaminated feces, and in a space where hundreds of people were chained without access to any hygiene. It was practically inevitable. The symptoms include severe bloody diarrhea, intense abdominal cramps, high fever, and extreme dehydration. Without modern treatment, severe dehydration kills within days. And here there was no intravenous fluid, no antibiotics, Nothing. If you got dysentery on that ship, your chances of surviving were very low. But dysentery wasn't alone. Scurvy was another constant threat. It's caused by a lack of vitamin C, and on a voyage where the diet consisted of beans, contaminated water, and some dried grain, vitamin C was non-existent. Scurvy makes your gums bleed, your teeth fall out, your bones ache with an intensity that has no description, and your old wounds reopen on their own because the tissue can no longer regenerate. And it also kills. There was also what at the time was called ship fever, which was most likely typhus, transmitted by lice that thrived in those conditions. Typhus causes sustained fevers of 40 degrees Celsius for days at a time, delirium, skin rashes, and organ failure. The mortality rate from typhus without treatment is around 20 to 30% under normal conditions. On a slave ship, with people already weakened, without clean water, and without nutritious food, that number skyrocketed. And then there was smallpox. In the 17th and 18th centuries, smallpox was one of the most deadly diseases in the world. It did not discriminate. It killed the rich and the poor, Africans and Europeans, the young and the old. In overcrowded spaces like the hold of a slave ship, if one person had active smallpox, contagion was a matter of days. The mortality rate from smallpox could reach 30% even among healthy, well-fed people. Among captives who were already weakened, starving, and with no immune defenses, the number was considerably higher. Historical records, which do exist and have been analyzed by scholars like Marcus Rediker in his book The Slave Ship, A Human History, show that the average mortality rate on transatlantic slave trade voyages was between 12 and 15%. That means that out of every 100 people who boarded the ship, between 12 and 15 died before arriving. In the worst voyages, with massive disease outbreaks, mortality could exceed 30, 40, even 50%. And the bodies were not kept. They were thrown into the sea. The sharks of the Atlantic learned to follow the routes of the slave ships. That is also documented. That is not a metaphor. It is a historical fact that naturalists and sailors of the era recorded with astonishment and horror. Now, if you managed to survive the diseases, there was still the problem of water and food. The daily water ration for a captive on many ships was approximately half a liter. Half a liter of water per day. In extreme heat, with constant sweating, with diarrhea if you had dysentery. Chronic dehydration caused hallucinations, extreme weakness, kidney damage, and eventually death. And when the voyage extended beyond what was expected due to bad weather or unfavorable winds, the provisions were reduced. There are records of ships where the water ran out weeks before reaching port, and the sailors had to make horrifying decisions. The food was no better. A mixture of boiled beans, rice, or corn, poorly cooked, often rancid, served in buckets that were passed from hand to hand among the chained captives. No plate, no spoon, with their hands, in the dark. There is something else that very few people mention, and that I consider essential for understanding the psychological magnitude of what these people lived through. The noise, the darkness, the constant movement of the ship that caused mass seasickness in people who had never navigated before. Imagine hundreds of people vomiting at the same time in a space with no ventilation. Imagine the crying, the screaming, the prayers in different tongues, because on board there could be people from 10, 15, 20 different ethnic groups who shared no common language, who could not communicate with each other, who were absolutely alone in the middle of a crowd. Resistance existed, and this is where the story becomes complicated in a way that I think is absolutely essential to tell you. Not everyone accepted this in silence. There were mutinies on board slave ships, and they are documented. Historians have identified more than 400 recorded revolts during the period of the transatlantic slave trade. In some cases, captives managed to break their chains during the hours they were brought up on deck to breathe, took partial control of the ship, and in several notable instances, some managed to return to African shores. In other cases, the mutinies were crushed with calculated brutality, because the crew knew that if they showed weakness, they would lose control. The leaders of the revolts were executed publicly in front of the other captives to instill terror. But there was also another form of resistance that required no physical force: deliberate silence. Refusing to eat is a form of protest, and as a way of taking control over the only aspect of life that still belonged to them, the decision to live or to die. The merchants responded to this with torture instruments designed specifically to force feeding, known as the speculum oris, a kind of forceps that held the mouth open by force. Even in resistance, there was a response. And if after all of this you arrived in Rio de Janeiro, the fate that awaited you was not rest. It was the continuation of a life you had not chosen, on a continent you did not know, separated from your family, your language, your name. Brazil was the largest recipient of enslaved people in the entire American continent. It is estimated that between 1500 and 1888, when slavery was abolished in Brazil, approximately 4.9 million African people arrived in the country in a condition of slavery. That represents about 40% of the total African people brought to the Americas during the entire transatlantic slave trade. Rio de Janeiro was the main port. The Valongo slave market, located in the center of the city, was the largest in the Western world. Hundreds of thousands of people passed through it. Their remains, their physical traces, were discovered during excavations in 2011, and the site was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017. They are there, in the ground of a modern city, full of tourists and samba and caipirinhas. The traces of that history are still there. If you made it to Rio, if you survived the ship, the market, the auction, the first year on a plantation or in a master's house, if your body withstood all of that, if your mind found a way to not break entirely, you were a statistical exception, not a guarantee, an exception. And I believe that understanding that changes something in the way we see the world today, because the consequences of that history did not end in 1888 with abolition. They extended and continue to extend in racial inequalities, in the distribution of wealth, in access to education, in the way that some lives still count for less than others in the collective imagination of our societies. This history does not belong only to Brazil. It does not belong only to Africa. It belongs to all of us, because the modern world as we know it, with its global economy, its trade routes, its accumulation of capital in certain countries, and its structural poverty in others, was built in part on that machinery of horror we call the transatlantic slave trade. If you made it this far, I need you to do something. First, share this content. Not because I want more views, but because this history deserves to be told with the seriousness and detail we fail to give it when we reduce it to a single line in a textbook. Second, let me know in the comments which part of all of this impacted you the most. Was it the physical space on the ship? The diseases? The mutinies? The numbers? Tell me genuinely, because those comments tell me which stories to keep telling and how much we do or don't know about our own history. And if you want to keep walking this path of discovering the history nobody taught us properly, subscribe. Because what's coming is just as important, just as uncomfortable, and just as necessary.